Hi, this is Case Johnston. It's the Literally Podcast. We are broadcasting from my home in Ogden, Utah. Today we are with author Sharon Harrigan, who is talking about her new book, Playing with Dynamite. So we're doing this remote. Sharon and I went to graduate school together probably nearly a decade ago, which is great. 8 or 9 years ago.
We graduated 2012, right? I graduated 2012.
Yeah, I was 11, and so it's been nearly a decade, and it's great to see Sharon across the Facebook world, or FaceTime world. Yeah, so reading her book, I really enjoyed it because we rarely have memoirists on the podcast. We have a lot of novelists. We've had more poets than we've ever expected, right, Brendan? I mean, we never really, because poetry scares me as a writer. You know, I'm not much of a poet, and I know how to teach it, but I don't know how to do it, which don't tell any of my students that. But reading your book, I've been just loving it, mainly because of the voice. The voice is very, very strong from the very first page. But talking about voice, even from the beginning of the book, I have a question that I've never asked anybody else. That is, if you could have an accent from anywhere else in the world, what would it be, and why would it be that?
I just love that you're asking me a question you never asked anybody else. I mean, how great is that?
Yeah.
Well, I have to be stereotypical and say French because part of my book is set in Paris.
Right.
So.
Right. And then there's a part in the book where Sharon talks about how she went around with an accent when she was younger, and she just said, I didn't think I was trying to talk in an accent like this. Thought I was just enunciating really, really well. You know, I was very articulate.
Yeah. I just wanted to sound educated.
Yeah, and which is a really, really interesting point in the book. It really sets up the book to talk about this growth and this journey through talking about your father and his life and the way you viewed it and everything that way. So I thought it was really, really it was a lovely moment in the book. So if you haven't picked it up yet, go out and buy Playing with Dynamite from Sharon Harrigan. All right, we're gonna get to listen to Sharon read an excerpt from her book.
Monty Python British accent.
Monty Python British accent. Please do.
That's actually my first choice.
It'll change your tone completely, but it'll be excellent. All right. Yeah. Excellent.
Okay. So I'm going to read a short excerpt starting on page 34. And since I'm not starting at the beginning, I'll just give you a little bit of setup. This book grew out of an essay that was published in the Rumpus in 2011 called Revenge of the Prey, How a Deer Killed My Dad. And I didn't think anybody would read this essay. I sent it to the Rumpus impulsively, didn't show it to anybody. And then at some point, my mother comes to visit, and you'll see that this excerpt is the beginning of what happens when I realized that it was naive to think that no one would ever read this essay. I didn't have to dig deep to see why I didn't show that essay to my mother. I didn't want to remind her that she had witnessed cruelties. My father telling my brother Louis he wasn't man enough and making him feel he didn't deserve to be his father's son. I didn't see my comeuppance. I didn't ask my mother for her thoughts or advice, yet magically I expected my son would ask me. My son who wouldn't show me his college application essay, just to explain. We drank our coffee. I sighed, paced, steamed, commiserated, mother to mother. Then, abruptly, my mother plunked her cup on the kitchen island and cleared her throat. Speaking of essays, I stopped puttering with the cabinets and pots, pulled up the stool, and braced for the moment I dreaded for months. It took a while to coax out what she wanted to say. I read the essay about your dad, she finally continued. Aunt Mary saw the link on Facebook and sent it to me. If my family had been home, I could have slipped into another room, claiming my daughter Ella needed me to find her a pair of socks or a hairbrush. The quiet in the kitchen made the bird coos sound like whales. All I could do was whisper, "Oh, I'm sorry." Was I sorry I'd written the essay, or that we'd all had to live through what it described? We sat stool to stool, staring into our cups. Was it, this time she had to finish my sentence, true? I nodded. She nodded back. At least she didn't think I lied. It's true your dad took your sister hunting instead of Lou. It's true your dad was a man's man and Lou was not. But is that enough? She didn't have to finish the sentence. Was that enough to want someone dead? Lou has a photographic memory, my mother said. Silently, I filled in the rest, so he must be right. My mother likes to mention my brother's amazing recall, a trait he inherited from our father, and I've always believed in his almost supernatural ability, but now I was beginning to wonder. I don't think Lou ever characterized himself that way. We forget what we need to forget, if we're lucky. You know, my mother said, emotions. She let her words trail off, but I knew what she meant. Emotions are not the same as facts. Aloud, I just said, yeah, then turned up my palms. Maybe all the answers would fall through the kitchen ceiling like rain.
Thank you so much for the reading. I love this excerpt for one main reason, and it really is at the crux of being a memoirist. I mean, this whole thing is, the question that I actually wrote down for you is, why do novelists have it so easy? But the real question is why is being a memoirist or have written a memoir so difficult? And it's for moments exactly like this. And I've been in your shoes where somebody reads an essay and that's how they say it. They say, I've read your essay, and your whole body sweats. I get complete body sweats, right? I mean, I'm sure you went through that exact same thing. And I want to explore a little bit more, because your first reaction was an apology, you know?
Yeah.
And looking back now, and you define it far more in the book as we go further, but for our listeners, why the apology, and why was that? Why do you believe that was the first reaction to your mom? It's just saying, I've read your essay, before she even told you if she liked it.
Because I didn't ask her permission, because the story I was telling was not just my story, but her story, because she probably knew more about what actually happened to my father than I did, and because she's a very private person, and because for many, many years we didn't talk about my father, which made me believe there was a reason we didn't talk about him, that there were things people wanted to hide. And here I was unearthing him, and I had this deep fear that I didn't understand that was a dangerous thing to do.
Mm-hmm. I think you touched.
And yet I felt compelled to do it anyway.
Right, and send it to the Rumpus, and it's and the Rumpus isn't like a really small publication. I mean, this is one of the most respected, well-read publications for this genre in the country.
Yeah, and with the internet, all you have to do is Google it, right? It's not like you even have to go to the library.
Yeah, it's there. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know that feeling, and it's that moment when you recognize that as a writer, when you're writing it, you're thinking about, a lot of times you're thinking about sentences, and you're thinking about craft, and that larger scope of this affects other people doesn't play into it while you're at the desk sometimes. And then, of course, the line in the book was that you stated basically you didn't believe that it was going to get published, and then all of a sudden, very soon afterwards, they said, we'd love to publish this essay. So why do novelists have it easy in that sense then?
Oh, you can always say it wasn't true. Yeah. I mean, even though I've heard novelists say sometimes, all I did was change the name, everything else is true, you can always say that it isn't.
Yeah, and throughout the memoir, and like I said, if you haven't read it, you need to pick it up. There is this struggle between, obviously, the whole memoir focuses on the struggle between your truth and memory and other people's truths, and how they depict your father, who you lost at a very young age. And obviously with creative nonfiction and memoir, the aspect of truth is at the heart of everything. Right. Do you feel like at the end of this book that you got closer to the truth, at least?
Yeah, I mean, I started out with questions, some questions about what happened to my father. How did he really die? Because what I had been told and the story that I told myself didn't really make sense. He was going hunting for a deer and a deer killed him. How does that happen? And also, the other question I thought I needed to find out is, why did he blow off his right dominant hand and forearm with dynamite before I was born? What was he doing with the dynamite? And all I'd ever heard was he was playing with dynamite.
Right.
And what did that even mean? So I do find out the answers to those questions at the end, but not until the end. But what I really found out, though, is that those weren't the main questions. The main question was not about my father; it was about me, and it was why was I afraid to ask those questions? Why was I afraid to ask anything about my father? Why was I afraid to ask about the most pressing questions about my childhood? And that I find out too, and it's not what I thought, but I did have reasons to be afraid.
Right. So I'm guessing that you found out the what happened pretty quickly, but it was the why and the the much larger questions that were probably from as far with reading the book, asking the kind of what happened within those kind of mystical moments of other people's memories is more important, and how did that affect you as a child and as an adult?
Right. And what I found out was that because my father died when I was 7, I didn't really understand death. And children of that age have this kind of magical thinking. The line between real and fantasy and magic is very blurred. And so I had kind of decided what it meant when I was 7 and carried around that idea, that magical thinking with me, and didn't realize it and had to unpack all that.
What I found so wonderful about the book is the honesty in it. And it wasn't just honesty as in the sense of as in telling the truth, but it's the honesty on the page of this self-discovery as the book goes on. And as writers, to be able to be that vulnerable with the writing itself, to say, I don't know, but I'm going to take you with me as I don't know more, was really, really, really well done. And that voice was just so easy to follow.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say that that's one of the most difficult things about writing creative nonfiction as well, is having to be vulnerable and having to turn yourself into a character and then show on the page what you don't even show sometimes to the people you know the best in your life. I've had friends read my book and say, oh, there are things I found out about you that I didn't know. And we've had many, many, many conversations over the years. So there's just another layer. You go a little bit further to reveal things, and that's hard to do, making yourself that vulnerable, as you know.
Yeah, it is, and it's done well. It's crafted really, really well in this book, and with Sharon's book, she from the very beginning, that vulnerability and that authenticity is really there, and so you'll love it when you read it. We touched a little bit about the title, Playing with Dynamite, and you said, what does that really mean, playing with dynamite? It's kind of like playing with fire. It's like this idea of how are we using the euphemism of playing when it comes to things that are dangerous, right? And when I read it, I thought obviously both ways. This is how he lost a limb, obviously, but then obviously when you open up these questions that you dug into your family, and that's it's Pandora's box once you start asking those questions, and you were playing with dynamite throughout this whole thing, because
that's what I found out.
because what's gonna happen here, which you and then secondly, talking about you exploring and exposing parts of yourself on the page that a lot of people hadn't known about you for so long. It's a really interesting kind of way of looking at that. We as writers don't find out who we really are till we write it down. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. I think Joan Didion said, I don't know what I'm thinking until I write to figure out what I'm thinking. And I think, maybe the corollary is that we write about our lives to find out about our lives. Yeah, I think I actually started this book thinking that I wouldn't have to, that it would be about my father and it wouldn't have to be about me. So that, of course, I wonder how many other memoirists feel that way.
That was just silly. That was
Yeah, but then you, of course, realize that if you're going to get other people to tell you their secrets, you have to tell your own, right? It's like what you learn as a teenage, preteen sleepover parties. That's how you get people to share with you. You have to share too.
Yeah, that's never anything I ever dealt with, but It makes a lot of sense, it does. But now that I will write that into something someday for sure. But with the title, did you know from the beginning, or did your publisher decide on that? Was this your working title?
Did I know that I'm playing with dynamite?
Yeah.
I didn't know, like when I first published the essay in the Rumpus, because I really naively thought nobody would read it. But I knew that I was doing something that felt dangerous. So yes, I guess I did. And, the question is like, why did I feel compelled to do it anyway? I think there was, I tried to write about my father in fiction, and it just, because I had so many questions, it always felt like it stayed on the surface. Mm-hmm. And I realized that really I had to kind of make myself into a character and show my search. And you were talking about that structure, which is similar to the structure that you used in your memoir. Mm. And that's sort of not the structure of a novel. It seemed like if I was going to really tell about these questions and getting answers, I had to tell it like a, kind of like a detective story.
Right. And keeps you, obviously, with me, it keeps you, every time you go into that new interview with the structure, there is a bit of that tension, saying what's Sharon going to find here, and we get that really early on within the book, which leads me to a question about kind of the shaping of the book. You kind of brought it up, and the idea that because you teach memoir, correct?
Right.
Yeah. So
for 4 years.
So what did you do? Like, is there anything that you've done differently in shaping and writing this book that differs from what you would teach your memoir students in the classroom on how to shape it and develop it?
I know a lot more now than I did then. And I guess what I tell people to do and what's worked for them is to really think of the scene as the building block for the book. I mean, it seems kind of a no-brainer. It's what novelists and short story writers, it's what fiction writers do. But I think the same is true for memoirists, and I didn't really understand that at the beginning, that it's about scenes. And so because I didn't remember a lot about my father, who died when I was so young, I had trouble developing scenes and writing about him and my childhood. So I've used with my students this book called, I don't need to show it to you.
No, I'd love to see it.
Writing Life Stories by Bill Rohrbeck. Mm-hmm. And he has a lot of exercises at the beginning about how to prompt your memory, how to jog your memory. And I would have used some of those, making maps of physical places like your childhood home, your childhood bedroom, the streets where you grew up, and filling in details as they come to you, using photographs to jog your memory, using objects, doing timelines, that can be really down to the micro level of a day or a month or a year. And all these kind of things that I've used with my students to really help them remember specifics, enough information to have lots of scenes. That would have been helpful for me, because partly Kirkus Review said that my book is the predominant theme is the unreliability of memory. So I kind of went into it thinking that I could just say, well, there are certain things that were traumatic and I don't remember them very well. Mm-hmm. But there are ways to bring our memories back, to trigger our memories. Sure. And I think I would have had an easier time if I had used some of those strategies that I use with my students on myself.
Yeah. It's a great, I might pick up that book for my students too. It sounds really fantastic when it comes to exercises and stuff. Yeah. It's
really practical, and it's really comprehensive, and just kind of guides you through the beginning of triggering your memory, and then how to write scenes, and then how to string scenes together. Mm-hmm. Instead of thinking about writing a chapter, you just think of a scene at a time.
Sure.
See the threads. And
with your memoir students, do you find before they are able to write scenes well, what do you find that they typically? What do you find that you need to move them away from? That for new memoirists, for new writers, that you want to move them to scene?
Yeah, I think they start out just telling, just a lot of description and a lot of summary. They'll tell about every summer we did this, or every Monday we did this, but these kind of repetitive things, and it's more general. And I want to zoom them into a specific time and a specific place. And that seems to really then there's so much more sensory detail, there's so much more emotion, and it feels so much more alive. But I think, usually people tell stories in a summary, and so getting them to think of it like a movie.
Mm-hmm.
And using photographs helps, because a photograph is a particular time and place.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I find the same thing. It's kind of they want to cover 4 years, and they want to start at the very beginning. And
exactly.
I always like to use Chunk from Goonies. When he talks about, in the first grade, I pushed my grandma down the stairs and I blamed it on the dog. And then on second grade, I did this. And then fourth grade, I threw up in the theater. And, and I think, we don't need to start that far back, and in Goonies, they're saying, okay, just tell us what we need to know here. Put us to where are your friends, and so, but they're laughing the whole time. And I think students tend to do that, kind of like you said, exactly this long form summary that everything has to be there, where a scene will do all the work for them, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, sometimes people think that they really just have to document everything. If they don't include everything, they're not being true. And I have to get them to realize that that you're not documenting, you're creating story.
Right. Absolutely. This is Case Johnston. This is the Literally Podcast. Today we are talking with Sharon Harrigan about her book, Playing with Dynamite, that was released in late 2017. It's a memoir about finding her lost fathers through interviews of family and friends of his to recreate or to put together a puzzle that she had long avoided doing. You talk about in the book that this started with the Rumpus essay. When do you think this search began, even if it wasn't going to be in book form?
Yeah, well, technically, the Rumpus essay grew out of a blog post. So the book started with a blog post that I wrote when my daughter turned 8, and I said my father never got to see me turn 8.
Mm-hmm.
And why I decided to write about my father at that moment, I don't know. There was something reliving my childhood through my daughter, definitely. I saw her kind of as a stand-in for me, and I think this is true with some other parents have told me that when your children go through certain milestones, it reminds you of going through those milestones yourself. And I have an older son, but maybe the fact that she was a girl and she was so much more of a stand-in for me than he was, I don't know. So that was the beginning. The most important thing that has ever happened to me, I always felt, was my father's death.
Mm-hmm.
It's my family's story. It's the story we carried with us everywhere. And there was always a mystery around it. So as I, became a writer and was writing fiction, I always knew that there was I had a story, just like my characters had stories, and that I was kind of playing out, giving them bits of my story, and that they were only getting bits. So in order to really make it as powerful as it felt to me, I had to kind of put the whole story together.
Mm-hmm.
So how long have I wanted to do that? It feels like forever.
Yeah. And how long did it take you to do all of the interviews and put the book together?
Yeah, so the essay was published in 2011, but then I was writing fiction, and I started writing the book in 2013. We were living in Paris for a year right after my MFA, and my mother came to visit, and she had started, after she read my essay, the one that I just read about in the excerpt, every time I saw her, talk to her, stories about my dad just started coming unbidden. It seemed like she had been waiting my whole life for me to be ready. And so when she got to Paris and she was telling me more stories, I thought, well, if I'm going to make this into a book, I need to ask her permission. So at that point I did, and she gave me her blanket permission. So that's when I started it in earnest.
I have one more question. Basically, since writing this memoir, and because this book is an open, honest book which covers all the hardest things in life. It really does. There's death, there's life, there's many other things that women go through that are difficult. And that's as a man, I feel just silly saying it that way. But there's things in this that are some of the most difficult things for women to go through. By exploring this side of narrative nonfiction, how do you think that this might inform or change the way in which you write fiction in the future?
So your question is, how is my experience with memoir? How will that change my fiction? And I think that, in memoir, certainly we get into people's heads, the narrator's head, the writer's head. And so that kind of intimacy that I tried to share in my memoir is something that I think I want to use in my fiction too. I want it to feel as if these are real people, right? And that I've gotten into their heads, and that they're revealing things that they don't necessarily reveal to the world around them, that they're revealing these to the reader. And the reader feels this vulnerability and this unflinching honesty.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking forward to anything that you have coming out next. This is a book that really, as I said at the beginning, is authentic and honest and gives the reader this feeling that they're on the quest with Sharon as well. And that's so hard to do, and I believe that she's done it so well. We want to thank Sharon for joining us today on the podcast. If there's anything else that you want to talk about with your book before we sign off, anything that we didn't cover that you'd want to share with us?
Maybe just one thing. I was just thinking that, what would I do differently to all you memoir writers out there? There's a great book called Evicted by Matthew Desmond, and he's an anthropologist, so he's not a memoirist, but he collects people's stories, which is kind of what I did and what some memoirists do. He's got this great section in which he talks about his methods, and he said that somebody would tell him a story about getting evicted, and then he would go back to that person and ask that person to tell him the story again, sometimes multiple times. And he would find that sometimes the first time it was incomplete, or then the second time he gets a little bit different angle. And I kind of found a little similar thing when I would go back and ask people who had told me stories to tell me the same story again, that sometimes they would give me something a little bit different or additional, and so maybe if I were going to do it again, I wouldn't think I got this story. I would think I got one version of the story. Now I'm going to ask tell me the story again. Tell me the story of how you met. Tell me the story of your wedding. Tell me the story of the funeral. And because what I learned is not just that memory is unreliable, but that people tell bits and pieces. And what you happen to get at one moment is going to be maybe different from what they'll tell you another time. And it's not like one is true and one isn't.
I've never thought about doing that. And that sounds, because they say that our memory changes like every day that we move forward. That's something.
Right. At some point you have to stand up. You have to stop. Okay, this is the version I have.
Yeah, of course. But that's a great idea, though, to go back and ask a second time, because some people, when it's fresh, I think they're just doing their best to just grasp at memory, right? And maybe the second time, maybe you give them opportunity they've pulled from that past, and then it's on their brain for a while, and it's been able to kind of saturate their new memories and where they belong in the world. And then all of a sudden, if you ask them again, maybe that it's been more developed or more thought through, or that's cool. I'm done with creative nonfiction, but if I ever were to do another creative nonfiction book, I would definitely use that as a way.
That's what you'd say.
No, I'm
done for now.
I am so done. At least in the long form, I'm guessing. How do you feel about that? Are you excited? I'm guessing you're probably still writing a lot of fiction right now. Are you excited to get back into? I'm
writing fiction now.
Yeah.
For the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, and I hate to say it this way, but it's nicer. At least the process of it it's not so taxing. I think that's the best. Yeah. Because this stuff, like I'm reading your book, and the writing of it is probably the easiest, because the way your voice is, like if you haven't read Sharon's stuff, she's got a really great voice, and she's one of, reading this book, I just loved the sentences all the way through it.
I loved sentences. You. That's the best praise.
That is, yeah, it really is. I know that feeling. But I could just imagine it takes a toll. It takes a huge toll to do a book like this. And if you haven't picked it up, you really should pick it up. It's published from Truman State University. You'll be glad that you did.
I just have a quick personal question.
Hi.
Hi, Sharon. Thanks for your time today. I really appreciate learning more about you. I also have a father who died when I was young, and I did some photography projects to discover more about him, and it had to do with the Kodaks he sent back from Vietnam, where we suspect he was where he was affected by Agent Orange and later died at a youthful age for him from the effects of that. And after the art project, to me, I felt sad. And so I'm curious to know now, after your project is through, how have your feelings changed and what's different? Like, how do you feel now?
How do I feel about my father's death?
Yeah. And like, what changed along the way? And was that an experience that, since you went through it, you're glad you did?
I am glad I did, but Case is right. It was very stressful. And I was afraid of hurting people's feelings. I was afraid of what I would find out. And I was afraid of people getting mad at me. And also I was afraid that because I identified so closely with my father, people would tell me that I looked like him, I inherited his red hair, that if I found out bad things about him, that would make me feel bad about myself. And so I did find some bad things about him, but then I had to, at some point, because I was still identifying with him, try to find some common ground and try to see myself in him and see our similarities. So he took risks. He drove fast with sometimes no hands at all. He did all these things, and he played with dynamite. And so I had to think, well, in what ways have I taken risks? And maybe there are different kinds of risks, and he was like really interested in arcane philosophy and esoteric stuff. And so I would think, well, in that way, I'm like him too. And so in finding our commonalities, that actually made me feel much closer to him. It made him seem like a human being instead of a mythical figure. And it felt like I couldn't properly grieve for him until I made him a human. I couldn't mourn someone who wasn't real. So the process of finding out about him for me was a process of making him real enough so that I could finally say goodbye to him. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah.